Welcome to the virtual program about personal identity, race, and the Peace Corps experience. My name is Pat Wand, and I'm president of the Museum of the Peace Corps Experience Board. Thank you for joining us, all of you, for choosing to spend your evening with us, participants, speakers, group facilitators, and recorders. And I want to give a shout out to the National Peace Corps Association for co-hosting this program. Our technical support tonight is provided by NPCA staff Ariana Richard and Dan Baker. The mission of the Museum of the Peace Corps Experience is to shine light on Peace Corps ideals. And the purpose of the Many Faces of Peace Corps, a museum initiative, is to encourage reflections by Peace Corps volunteers who come from traditionally underrepresented groups in the United States. We believe the topic of racism must be addressed openly in our society and in the Peace Corps community. And thus, we have chosen this topic and will compile a report of what is shared in this session. Privacy will be respected, and no persons will be identified in the report without prior agreement. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our program moderator, Diane Hebano. Diane has deep roots in Peace Corps, beginning as a volunteer in Bolivia from 1967 to 1970. She worked as staff in Peace Corps headquarters from 1988 to 91, and then from 91 to 96, she was back in Bolivia, first as staff and then as country director. Diane Hebano is also on the advisory team for Many Faces of Peace Corps. We are delighted that she agreed to serve as moderator today. Diane, I turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you for coordinating your efforts for tonight's event. I am delighted to moderate the program and look forward to your contributions to the conversation on our racial identities and the Peace Corps experience. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Jonathan Zimmerman. He was a Peace Corps volunteer in Nepal from 1983 to 1985. And he's currently a professor of history of education at the University of Pennsylvania. His scholarship has focused on ways that different peoples have imagined and debated education across time and space. He's also authored books about Americans who taught overseas, among many other works. His father was the country director for Peace Corps in both India and in Iran. Tonight, John will provide the context for the discussion on race and identity with a summary of his research on how volunteers have thought about race and the Peace Corps over the years. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Diane, and thanks to Pat also for organizing this and including me. I'm delighted to be here. And with respect to the theme of tonight, I thought that the best thing I could do was just to tell a couple stories about the work that I did and what I learned about the Peace Corps and race. When I was a volunteer in Nepal, I didn't know that I was going to be a historian, but I did become one after I came home. And I started to think about the Peace Corps historically. The first project that I did was a project about African Americans who served in the Peace Corps in the 1960s. And what it did to their ideas about race and identity and civil rights and Black power. And it wasn't an easy project to do, and here's why. The Peace Corps did not keep racial and ethnic records. This was kind of part of the colorblind ethos of the time. The folks in charge of Peace Corps at the time, Sergeant Shriver, Bill Moyers, Harris Wofford, they were considered on the left of the Kennedyites. Indeed, Shriver was known in the White House as the House Communist. But even so, in the ethos of the time, it was felt that it would be racist to keep records about race. So the only way I could identify African-American Peace Corps volunteers was by going to the National Archives and looking at still photos. and just trying to figure out who the Black volunteers were, and then getting some addresses. This is well before the internet, and writing to people. And sometimes I got things wrong. I mean, I got some funny letters, which I was looking at earlier today, including one saying, Professor Zimmerman, your research sounds fascinating, but I'm not Black. I just kind of got it wrong on the photo. But I did eventually manage to contact about 50 African-American volunteers, ex-volunteers, and taped interviews with them, which I donated to the Kennedy Library and which have been transcribed there. And the major theme of those interviews, and I think the most relevant theme for tonight's discussion, was the way that this experience altered at the time how African Americans thought about race. When they got to countries like Nigeria and Kenya, they discovered that those countries were actually as diverse as the United States. It's just that everyone was Black to our eye. And the dominant theme of the interviews was the way that our language about race actually collapsed differences within it. If you think about the metaphors that we use to talk about diversity and race in this country, think about the rainbow. You have your reds, your blues, your oranges, and your yellows, but they're not differentiated internally. Like the blues are really blue, and the greens are really green, and there's no such thing as light green or dark green. Well, the African-American volunteers who went to Africa discovered otherwise. They actually discovered the enormous diversity that a single race, putting that in quotes, could contain. And I should also tell you that even though the Peace Corps didn't keep racial records, the Peace Corps wanted African-American volunteers because African countries did. So one of the things I discovered in the archives was that the people in recruiting and selection had a secret date stamp that they used to put on the apps, on the applications, the volunteers whom they knew were African-American. This was a way of trying to get around the prohibition on collecting that information. So that was the first project that I did. The second one, which Diane mentioned, was a much longer book about Americans who taught overseas in the 20th century. And it looked at Americans who taught in the American colonies. Americans don't like to think about us having a formal empire, but we did in places like Puerto Rico and the Philippines, missionaries, of course, and then post-war volunteer agencies like the Peace Corps. And there, what I discovered was an enormous shift in the way that American teachers imagine race and difference. In the early 20th century, they imagined it through this lens that was called civilization. And civilization was either a binary, like, you're civilized and I'm civilized and you're not, or it was a ladder, like some civilizations were more civilized than others. And obviously this was inflected by eugenics and all kinds of other racial science. Today we would say pseudoscience. But after the Second World War, and especially after the battle against Nazism, which discredited racial science in so many different ways, Americans who went overseas, including Peace Corps volunteers, they discarded the civilization language and they started to talk in terms of culture. And culture wasn't a binary, like I'm cultured, you're not. And it certainly wasn't a ladder. It was horizontal. When you see the Celebrate Diversity sticker, it is horizontal. The rainbow's horizontal. It never goes like that. It goes like this. And one of the things I discovered in doing this book was that was an enormous achievement in its own right. That is to start to think about people around the world as not worse than you in any way, but different from you. And yet, to go back to the first theme of my Black Peace Corps volunteers piece, it also brought some problems with it because it again encouraged us to think of these cultures in undifferentiated ways. And this proved to be an enormous problem when, for example, Peace Corps volunteers are confronted with sexism in other countries, girls being unable to go to school or only in a couple grades. And in the archives, I found Peace Corps volunteers saying things like, well, look, this is their culture. In their culture, wherever we're talking about, it's boys that go to school and girls don't. And who are we? Who are we as Americans to interfere with that? Well, I argued that was a problem because, first of all, girls in those societies are part of the culture, and many of them wanted to go to school. And what if you argue that the culture of a certain nation is X, right? You set yourself up as the arbiter of what that culture is. Are there different kinds of sexism and misogyny in many countries of the global South? Yes, I think that's quite a fair thing to say. But I don't think everyone in your societies believes in those ideas. And I think the women in those societies who have fought for freedom and liberty and equal rights are every bit as much a part of those cultures as the men who are trying to deny those rights. But the problem with the metaphor is I think it did lead to this, what I call protectionist idea, that Nepali culture, to take an example, is X, is caste driven, or, is gendered. And again, who are we to interfere with that? The most recent iteration of this, and I will just end with this, is the idea of white saviorism, which has become, over the past couple of years, a very, I would say, strong critique of Peace Corps. And, there are entire websites and Instagram accounts devoted to this. And the thesis goes something like this: Peace Corps is problematic, that's the word of the day, because Peace Corps imagines that, it can go into these other countries and enlighten them. Well, I would say a couple things about that. I would say, first of all, with respect to white saviorism, Peace Corps isn't as white as it used to be. It's about a third non-white. It's not as diverse as many of us would like it to be, but it's radically more diverse than it was in the early eras that I've studied. And the second thing I would say, consistent with some of the other themes that I've been trying to articulate, is that, the white saviorism critique actually sets up the criticizer as the arbiter of culture. So, what you'll never see on one of these websites is an acknowledgement that in almost every society, people that are actually counterparts of Peace Corps have welcomed them. And in post hoc surveys have been extremely positive about their interactions with Peace Corps volunteers. This really goes back to 1961. When Peace Corps was kicked out of a country, it was almost always for geopolitical reasons. It wasn't because the counterparts, the teachers or principals or nurses or medical workers didn't like the volunteers. Quite to the contrary, they were overwhelmingly positive about them. How do you theorize that if your theory is that Peace Corps is an evil white saviorist operation? I think the only way you can do this, and I noted it in my article, is to imagine that the people in the other country are themselves also victims of white saviorism. So they too are so caught up in this white saviorist ethos that they can't see how problematic the Peace Corps volunteer is. They're a victim of it too. And again, I would argue that, ironically, that's a very condescending view. It's brought to you by people who are themselves arguing that Peace Corps is condescending. But I think their suppositions about people on the other side of the equation are equally condescending, because they don't take account of the complexity and the differences within the societies that we've served. So hopefully that gives us at least something to talk about, and I'll be eager to meet all of you, or at least some of you, in the chat rooms. Thanks again.
Thank you, John, for your thought-provoking remarks, and good for further discussion. And now we'll hear from our panelists about their racial identity prior to Peace Corps and during their Peace Corps experience. Some of us arrived in our Peace Corps countries and did not look like the model white European American. Others did. We each had our own backgrounds, and now we had to adapt to a new culture. How were we received? How did we adjust? Did we change? Here are some questions that we hope to hear answers for from our panel. First, we'll hear from John Fleming, who was a volunteer in Malawi from 1966 to 68. Then Katrina Mathis, who was a volunteer in Guinea in Africa from 1994 to 1996, and then a Peace Corps recruiter from 1997 to 2002. Then we'll hear from Ursula Pike, a Bolivia volunteer from 1994 to 1996. And finally, from Sorphon Seng, a language and cultural trainer for Peace Corps Cambodia in 2012. We will begin with you, John Fleming, and each one follows in order.
I grew up in North Carolina in a segregated society in the 1950s and 1960s. When the students at A&T College sat in at Woolworths, in my small town of Morganton, we were sitting in at the local Woolworths and were able to integrate the public accommodations in the town. So I was very active in the civil rights movement, both in high school and in college. In fact, I participated in the march from Selma to Montgomery. I was brought up in both the Episcopal Church and the AME Church and wanted to be a missionary in Africa. I tried to join the Anglican Missionary Society and was accepted until they evaluated my application and found out that I had an American BA and they felt it was not equivalent to their British BA and suggested that I get an MA in order to teach in one of their high schools. So eventually I joined the Peace Corps, and surprisingly, I was assigned to Malawi, and that was the country I was going to go to with the Anglican Church as a missionary. I was active in, as I said, in the civil rights movement, and I joined the Peace Corps during the height of the transition from nonviolent activism to the Black Power movement. When I got to Malawi, I was really surprised at the extent to which expatriates, British, Southern Rhodesians, and South Africans still control various aspects of the country. I was assigned to the Southern region, and I was the first Black regional officer and in the Department of Agriculture as the Extension Aids officer. And one of the things that I noticed very quickly was that the expatriates were willing to accept me as part of their circle if I would identify with them, go to the country club, and participate in the government of Malawi as an expatriate. Well, I did not want to do that. I identified with my African colleagues, and that created a lot of I won't necessarily say hostility, but problems within the office. But I thought it was the right choice. I also decided that because I was living in Blantyre, which was the headquarters of the Peace Corps office, that I would sort of separate myself from the Peace Corps and really involve myself in my host country as well as with my colleagues and my neighbors. One of the things that I discovered which had an impact on my future decision to be a missionary was that the missionaries, both from the US and from Europe, were just as racist in their dealings with the Africans as people in the southern United States. And I decided very quickly that I did not want to be a missionary and be part of identifying with the racist expatriates, whether they were missionaries or not. So I brought a lot of baggage to my experience, and I think that it had an impact on how I chose to live as a Peace Corps volunteer in Malawi.
Thank you very much, John. All right, next we'll hear from Katrina Mathis.
Thank you so much. I'm Katrina Mathis, and I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Guinea, West Africa from 1994 to 96. And Jonathan Zimmerman, thank you so much for your scholarship. I just loved hearing you speak. So I'm from Atlanta, Georgia, and I was born in 71, and the first Black mayor was elected in 73. So my entire life, I have known nothing but Black leadership in Atlanta. I come from an affluent part of Black Atlanta where I saw nothing but successful Black people around me. Both my parents have advanced degrees. And it was a great time for me growing up. I was taught to be proud to be Black. I was proud to be American. And that was my life. There were two things that we were taught also as part of Black culture growing up, was that there were two things we had to do. You had to stay Black. You had to stay Black and die. Those were the only two things you had to do in life. So if you ever told someone, well, I'm not going to do that, your teacher would even say to you sometimes, the only two things you got to do, you got to stay Black and you got to die. So I was very certain in my Blackness. Okay. And so I requested to go to West Africa. I had taken a class in college. I knew that most of the enslaved Americans came from West Africa, but I wanted to go to a French-speaking country. So I was placed in Guinea, and I get there, and there was naturally a kinship. I naturally felt like I was with my cousins. It was beautiful until the first day that I went to my village, and the father of my family, who was also the head doctor there, was reading the autobiography of Malcolm X. And I was happy because I read it and I wanted to discuss it with him. And we were going back and forth, and we started talking about blue-eyed devils, and we got caught up in the pronoun. I was thinking it was we were getting lost in translation, and he kept saying you, and I kept saying them. And he kept saying, you blue-eyed devils, and I kept saying those blue-eyed devils. And we went back and forth until I realized, I said, you're talking about me. He said, yes, you're white too. And I was gobsmacked. I could not believe it. I didn't understand how all my life, or not all my life, but for a very long time, I had wanted to come to Africa, get to the motherland, and be with my people, only to be told that I wasn't Black. And then throughout my service, I came to learn that they felt they had a corner on the Black market. Like they literally were the Black people. And how do you argue with Black people in Africa about Blackness? It's just that I had been told all my life, all I had to do was stay Black and die. And now my Blackness had come into question by God's true Black people. So that was a bit much for me. It made me very militant, but it also expanded my view of the world. It ended up being a very good thing, simply because I saw myself as an American the way I was taught to see myself, the way that myself was reflected back to me through other people's eyes. And then I got to see a different part of myself. I didn't necessarily have to agree with the way they saw me, but it gave me a different worldview. It helped me to expand my consciousness around that. The same thing with being an American, that was called into question. They knew I was American, but to hear that a white American was more American than I was bothersome. Even if I protested once and I said, I guarantee you my people have been in the country in America longer than her people. She agreed with me. And they were like, but it doesn't count because we know you're from here. So it wasn't malicious. It was just irksome, but it was also very revealing. And then I would say, finally, as a woman, I was 22 years old when I got there. And most of the women I knew had babies and been married by the time they were 14 or 15 years old. And sometimes people interchange the word woman and girl when they referred to me because I didn't have children. That was offensive. I mean, incredibly offensive. And I still don't have children. And I'm sure now, because of my age, I would be called a woman. But the fact that, there was something less than that, I think definitely goes beyond African culture. I think that may even be universal. There's something less than about you if you've never given birth to children. And so I will leave that there.
Thank you, Katrina. Let's move on to Ursula Pike.
Hi, my name is Ursula Pike. I served as a volunteer in Bolivia, and it's great to be here tonight. And I am also a member of the Karuk tribe. Our territory is near what is now the California-Oregon border. When I went to Bolivia, I assumed that I would have a natural connection with the indigenous Bolivians, because Bolivia is primarily indigenous country. And, I grew up on the West Coast. My mother worked for several different tribes, managing timber resources. And so I grew up with this understanding of a connection with other Native people, who might have been from different tribes, but there were connections. There were differences for sure, but there were also connections. And so when I landed in Bolivia, I assumed that connection would show up right away, and it didn't. And thinking about this panel tonight, I remember a moment. There was one day, so I worked at a children's home, and there was one day where I was sitting in the kitchen with the other women that worked at the children's home, a tutor and the cook and the cook's aide, and the cook's aide was a young woman. She was Quechua, indigenous, and she wore traditional pollera, which is what Quechua women wear. And she said, "I'm thinking of not wearing my pollera anymore. What do you think, Ursula?" And at first I didn't understand. I mean, she said it in Spanish, and it took me a while to understand, well, what do you mean you're not going to wear your pollera anymore? And she just said, people look at me when I'm in my pollera and think I'm an Indio. And that has she didn't say negative connotations, but she said, people just think I'm a dumb Indian when they see me. And as a Native person, I, of course, wanted her to continue to feel like she could wear her traditional clothing, regalia. This is something that her mother and her grandmother had worn. But I also understood, as a Native person, the difficult choices that we have to make as a Native woman, especially for that, to ensure our economic survival. And I remember that moment, and wanting to encourage her to do what she wanted to do, even though I wanted her to be able to continue to wear it, because I know that indigenous cultures are dying everywhere. Well, also during that conversation, I said, I'm Native too. I'm indigenous. And the women that I was talking to, they laughed a little bit, and I was kind of embarrassed, but they said, well, maybe you're part indigenous, but you probably shouldn't call yourself an Indio, because that's really not something that is looked upon with respect here. And that conversation and other conversations that I had with Bolivians about indigenous identity really made me think about how here in the US, as an indigenous person, we really are expected to choose one identity. I'm indigenous, even if I have other backgrounds. And I'm very proud to be Keru, but there are other heritages in my family. And I really learned in Bolivia this understanding of being a mestizo, of being indigenous, but then having other backgrounds and being comfortable with that, understanding that our identities are not single individual things, especially in this world right now.
Thank you, Ursula. And now we'll hear from Sorphone Singh.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Ms. Diane, for introducing me. Of course, I'm not a volunteer, but I work a short period of time, about 4 months, because it's a short-term contract with Peace Corps, where they do this pre-service program to train the Peace Corps, the new group, to come in, and then they have time to adjust and also time to learn, so that they be able to survive as the local ones when they send out to their job sites, which is really rural back then in about 10 years ago. So again, my name is Sapon Saint Romain, and I live here in the state now in Louisiana with my 2 beautiful sons and my husband, A. Saint Romain, who was a Peace Corps volunteer in Cambodia, where we met, and then we just decided, okay, let's get married and move here. That's the story. But anyway, yeah, Cambodia, some of us might not know, it's a small country between Vietnam and Thailand, and we have really rich history and tradition and culture also. But I know that we was introduced heavily to the Western people by being in the under colonial of French, almost a century. It's 99 years. We almost lost our alphabet, y'all, but thankfully we did not. Thanks to our scholar, that we fight and we did not lose it. We still have it there to use it as to formally right now. And for that point of view, since then, it clicked into our people's view that all Westerners are white. It doesn't matter what your nationality are. It doesn't matter if you come from England. It doesn't matter when they see all this tall, white, sharp nose, you are foreigner. I mean, you are the barang. A barang is the term that they call foreigner that are white. And they have other term that call the black foreigner, I call Afrik, which is African. That's what they call them. And so much that we also use the term barang to refer to some type of vegetable that is kind of like bigger than usual, or the imported one that we don't have the term for it. So we use the word barang as a suffix to call the fruit. Sometimes my sister actually have a nickname barang because she used to be tall and white and almost have blonde hair for some reason. And that's what the term we call that, the foreigner, barang, so it doesn't matter. But yeah, it's safe to say Peace Corps has changed my life completely. I never imagined that I would came here and have a family and, you know, the state, Louisiana as my second home, but here I am. But 10 years ago, I never knew that, you know, American is so diverse, you know, ranging from black, white, you know, Cajun, to be honest, down south here, and, you know, Asian, Hispanic. I remember when we were introduced to the new group and then the term Hispanic coming out, and I was like, what is this? You know, I remember I had to Google it. It's like, okay, what is this term Hispanic refer to? Like, oh, okay. We never knew at all. And then as a part of the, you know, job, I got to work with these awesome American Peace Corps staff and the local staff just to help them out to make sure the new trainee is ready for their mission to send out to the rural area, be able to survive there. And I can, you know, because we have this type of the stereotype that the French colonial got onto us, we believe that the white people are more beautiful. We believe that the white people are more like smarter, like can do more better than others. So of course, right now, girls in Cambodia, they are more popular with white skin, so they bleach their skin. They do some procedure to make their nose sharp, you know, to make their nose like look like a foreign one, a barang one. So, and I also noticed that the volunteer of color have a little what do you say, a hard time to be accepted by the local one. It's because that they're not used to with this American faces as the black one or as the Asian one. They have a better time doing so. And but I also noticed on the other side that the Asian American volunteer has a better time accepting by the local host family. It's because it's like for example, across Asian nation, we love rice. And in Cambodia, we eat rice 3-4 times a day. Every meal has to include rice, breakfast rice, lunch rice. So they have a better time enjoying food with our host family, and also the way of the family oriented. That is the way we raise across a nation. It doesn't matter where we are, but our family always raised like that, to respect the elder and stuff like that. And we have a lot of time that host family came and say, oh yeah, I'm so pleased with my African Asian American kid, because they always refer to them as their own child when you station with the host family, that, oh yeah, they're really respectful and easy to feed. It's amazing. But on the other hand, we have some host family that's come and say, why do I got the black one? Or why do I got this Asian, volunteer? They're American, but not American. And as a part of my job and also the Peace Corps staff, we have to work a little harder and to try to promote, to support at both sides, with the local one and the volunteer, to help them build up this, relationship. And also to reassure that it doesn't matter what color, doesn't matter what they look like, they are capable of doing the same thing as their mission to stand for. And, myself also experienced adjusting to come here to Louisiana. I have to learn from scratch, not from scratch, new thing. Of course, back almost 10 years ago, my language is not really good. It's plus, Southern state, they have accent, they have Creole people, they have Cajun. So sometimes I have a hard time to do too. And, I have to learn to cook new dishes. I learn to use this new technology and appliance. So I have some time to adjust, but lucky me, I have the family around here to, support me and make this transitions really better, I guess. So I'm considering me lucky one.
Thank you, Sarpong. It's interesting to hear all of your stories and your background. And next, as we move on in the evening, we will break into smaller groups, but I'd like to give you a little information first. You should know that the Many Faces of Peace Corps Advisory Team, our group, is aware of the National Peace Corps Association's town halls that were held during the COVID pandemic in the summer of 2020, after the evacuations of volunteers, and the resulting recommendations made to the Peace Corps agency. Peace Corps also issued a diversity report in April of this year, which clearly articulates its commitment to DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. The agency should, and here I'm going to give you a few quotes, take a stand against racism and re-examine how it supports its BIPOC trainees, volunteers, and staff members. That is, Black and Indigenous people of color. And it goes on, staff needs training on diversity and inclusion, as well as how to handle BIPOC experiences, and recognize that those experiences will be different from white volunteers. And finally, we must enforce an anti-racism policy with defined reporting mechanisms and stated consequences for racist behavior directed at volunteers, at staff, and at host country national community members. I believe that the agency is committed to these issues. Now, each breakout group will have a facilitator and a note taker. And at the end of 30 minutes, the group will agree on one principal takeaway from the discussions that the recorder will share with the larger group afterwards. As these sessions will not be recorded, notes will be taken for their content without names attached. So feel free to be candid and open with your discussions. Again, the topics are to describe your own racial identity prior to Peace Corps service and how that experience affected this identity, maybe how you were perceived by others, by volunteer, by staff, by host country, and vice versa. How did your perspective change, if at all? And what about today? Are there any lessons that you've learned? I hope the discussion was lively and informative, and we've asked every group to come up with one kind of main idea or takeaway. And I think our group, I'm going to start because I was the recorder for our group. I think we spent a lot of time sharing stories, looking at perspectives, and deciding that basically our own identities have not changed in the way we present ourselves. But what did change was the perspective of us looking at other cultures. One person in the group married somebody from another culture. Actually, two of us did. And so our outlook on how we look at other cultures and identify with them has changed because of our Peace Corps experience. Now I'm going to call on the group Katrina and Debbie. Debbie, can you give us the one takeaway?
Yes, very similar to yours in that culture, not color, was the thing that mattered and that influenced us the most. Culture, not color.
That's very good. Next, we have Violet and Randy. Randy is the recorder.
We had a variety of folk. A couple takeaways were, one was more capable of accepting her own heritage than previously, having encountered yet another culture. One, recognizing the American side of their African-American culture.
So we will go on to Carla and Evelyn. Evelyn?
Okay, well, I will pick up on Randy's. I think the experience that both the white people and the African Americans in the group, each of us came with very different experiences before we went in and, you know, talked about that. So going back to Zimmerman's point about these are not simple categories. There's so much diversity within each of our categories. And I'll just pick up what Randy said, that many people talked about their privilege of being Americans, owning their American identity more than they necessarily did when they entered the Peace Corps.
Okay, thank you. Ursula and Beto.
The one thing that resonated is the fact that, you know, we cannot bring a US centric lens when we're, you know, going to these countries. That was one. And then the other is, and this is a beautiful quote, that identity is a moving target. And, you know, it changes among space and time. So those are the takeaways that we, you know, the bigger picture is that, you know, those are some of the takeaways.
Thank you. Thank you. And Peggy and John Rood. John?
Well, of course, we came up with three things. So I'll choose the middle one, that we should not take or make assumptions about anyone based upon their appearance.
Yes.
Simple as that.
Excellent. Thank you. That's something I believe in as well. All right. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for doing this. And we thought 30 minutes was plenty of time, but we know when we have a group of Peace Corps people, the discussion is rich and full. We are now going to ask Beto Whitaker to just give us some brief key points in order to close our discussions this evening. He was a Peace Corps volunteer in Paraguay from 1997 to 1981, and he now chairs the Committee on DEI, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion of the MPCA, National Peace Corps Association Board. Beto?
So thank you. I want to begin. Many years ago, I read a book and his name is Antonio Gramsci, and he speaks of something called cultural hegemony. And, as I've been hearing this conversation and this discussion, this vibrant, great discussion tonight, I thought about cultural hegemony, whereas we are attracted to or are, associate with, someone who fits in that space, if you will, our space. And I see that, some of this conversation tonight wasn't also all about race, but culture, and how, we come from different cultures and just adapting to that. I mean, the piece of race does, add to it. But it has a lot to do with culture, cultural differences, cultural misperceptions. What I heard tonight, that oftentimes Americans, white Americans, Westerners were considered to be white, and if you weren't white in Africa, you were Black, but you were still considered white because you're a Westerner. So there are those cultural nuances that we really have to look at and understand. I would pose this question, for everyone that was a Peace Corps volunteer. Would I make the assumption to say that you left the country better than when you got there? Was there a learning curve that you gained? And is that something that you carry with you, even now? And then lastly, we've been talking a lot about, I'm just thinking of the age group, and one in our discussion brought up Corona, and the fact that we had volunteers that were living and actually had to be evacuated because of the coronavirus. But what that must have been like, it's something else that just came to mind. So that's really like a brief summary. But I think that, this culture versus race is so very important, and something that we could examine even further. If people find this to be really, something you would want to do again, we had talked briefly about a part 2 and what that might look like. But if there is an interest, that's something to consider moving forward.
Pat will talk about opportunities for that. Thank you, everybody, for participating in this. I know I was only in one breakout room, but I am sure there were 6 breakout rooms, and the discussion was just as rich in every one. And so now we will turn the mic back to the president of the Museum of the Peace Corps Experience, Pat Wand. Thank you, Pat.
Well, thank you, Diane, for leading us through such a wonderful journey. And everyone, thank you for joining us tonight and participating in this conversation. We purposefully chose to have an interactive program because we believe this topic needs to be widely discussed, and widely discussed by white people. Many of us have avoided it a lot of our lives, and we think it's time for us to be able to talk about it openly. And I hope you have found it informative and helpful, as I certainly have. Thank you to our speakers and the facilitators and recorders for your extra time and thoughtfulness in putting this together. Tonight, this is another opportunity I want to point out to you, another wonderful opportunity. Tonight, we were able to share just snippets of our own Peace Corps lives. And if you would like to be interviewed about your entire Peace Corps experience, we urge you to submit a request for an oral history interview. They are conducted by Zoom, and you can go to the Peace Corps Oral History website. The URL should be appearing in the chat, and you can fill out a request to be interviewed. It's a very active group. We've got hundreds of interviews here that we can all access at the University of Kentucky Library Nunn Archive Center. And while you're visiting that Peace Corps history, Peace Corps oralhistory.org website, you can also view a couple of videos that have been produced from those oral history interviews. One of them, Many Faces of Peace Corps, and another one, Save Your Place in History. They're both very worthwhile. And one last pitch, actually two. If you haven't already joined the membership for the Peace Corps Museum, please join us. It's free, and we will keep you informed about our activities and up to date about what's going on. And if you're interested in the work of Many Faces of Peace Corps, please let us know with an email. Send it to contact us at peacecorpsmuseum.org, and we'll respond. We have an advisory team that is made up of about 10 really very passionate people, and we can use some more input. And now I get to bid you adieu. And in this holiday time of giving and gratitude, I am reminded of that quote, "Blessed be the peacemakers." The work of Peace Corps is making peace. And let us continue our work of peace building wherever and whenever we can. The program has ended, but our work continues.